You are loved with an everlasting love. That's what the Bible says. And underneath are the everlasting arms. This is your friend, Elizabeth Elliott. Delighted to have again today in the studio my daughter Valerie and her husband Walt Shepard. Which of you would like to talk first?
We want to encourage parents to trust God for their children and not to worry. And I think Walt was just saying to us as we were talking before we started recording that the perspective it gives him as he looks back on his own life is helpful, that we can only take one day at a time with our children. And we trust God hasn't given us what the future is. He hasn't told us we need to worry about it. He's told us we are not to worry about it. We have a son who's almost 18. We have a daughter who's 15. Our 15-year-olds and under are all at home being homeschooled, and our son is going to be finishing up community college soon, which means he's at sort of a crossroads trying to decide what he wants to do next. And we want to encourage him, and yet we also simply have to wait on God to let God do the work in Walter's heart to lead him into whatever God wants to lead him into. Honey, what would you say has helped you to trust God day by day?
Well, the wonderful thing about having a dad like mine, and I always catch myself saying, now, what would Dad do? What would Dad was there to help me. I remember in those first few anxious hours when you came home from the hospital with that little boy, our first. And he was there when in my exuberance, I held him, lifted him high over my head, and banged his head on the beam in our den. And I looked over at my father, and he just went, "Aw, son." And I just remember some wonderful conversations with Dad and Mom. I'm so thankful that God gave Dad to us for 15 years after his first heart attack, where we could, do you remember those talks we had with him and just how wise he was, and fun seeing the relationship that he and Mom always had together, and being able to talk with him about, now, what do I do? What do I do? And he was always reluctant to give us advice, because he'd always say, no, that's something you need to talk over with Val. I guess the height of comments that Dad has made of helpful advice was this one thing that all of us kids have learned to say in growing up is, don't be nervous. Don't be nervous. And there are times when the problems are real and they're awful, and it's time for lesser men to get very nervous. And I'm just remembered of Dad's tone of voice, even when talking to us, is just, don't get nervous. Don't be all upset. I think this is a tremendous thing as we think about raising our own, Val, in terms of the very fact that what we have because of the covenant, because of God's faithfulness, is we have perspective. We don't have a shaky ground that is falling out from under us when we think about our kids and we think about these older ones. I don't know what's going to happen to them. I don't know what they're going to do with their lives, but I do know that I can occupy myself totally with today. How this helps me as a father, the real test, I think, of my Christian life is what happens when everybody's in bed and the whole house is silent and it's just me and the Lord. There have been some times when, as a pastor or as a father, I've had those moments where I've said, Lord, I want to be a plumber. I really do. And, or Lord, I want to be a good electrician. But just wondering out loud with the Lord, have you made a mistake, Lord? No, of course not. But that's been a real test for me in terms of, am I going to turn to the Lord, or am I really going to think for a moment, maybe even for 2 days straight, that it's all up to me? I think
one of the things that your parents seem to impress me with is that even if we made a mistake in what decisions we made for our children or how we trained them, even if we made a mistake, God's grace would cover our mistakes. As you said, they were reluctant to give us very much advice, very much specific advice. I remember your dad saying, trust God to show you at the time when it comes, when something like, you'll cross that bridge when you come to it. But even if you do wrong, if you make a mistake, that's in God's sovereign plan. He allowed it for some good purpose. And that helped me, I know. And I know his way of just saying, don't worry about it. Trust.
Yeah.
That always helped me.
And I think, too, the legacy left behind for me is the love my mom and my dad had. It was expressive. It was certainly not inappropriate ever, but it was very clear where Dad and Mom stood in their relationship together. And this has helped me because, yes, I can't worry about tomorrow. I can't worry about when my son graduates from the college. I don't need to. I need to give myself to what's going on today. And one of the great things that we could ever give our kids, is us fathers, is the love for the mom.
And don't you think that's what makes a functional home, when the parents love each other and the children are secure because they see that their parents love each other?
I'm not sure what a functional home is. I know
the opposite of a dysfunctional home, which we hear so much about.
I get so nervous about that because we're so dysfunctional. We're two-centered.
Sinfuls, right.
We dysfunction up a storm. But I think the aspect here that I can give my kids that security that you just mentioned, that they don't have any doubt in the world where the first priority is in Dad's life. That can be the best thing. That certainly was what Dad left behind for us 5 kids. And remember, that's really what God used to evangelize neighborhoods and even my school, was the love and the affection Mom and Dad had.
So I'm thankful that we are learning, and I'm definitely learning more than I did the first 10 years of our marriage, about showing affection in front of the kids. I've noticed in the last couple of years that my 2 teenage girls love the fact that we love each other, and they are happy when they see that we're affectionate because they've seen some other parents that aren't. And so I think my husband is following in his father's footsteps as far as just showing affection to me. And I'm just like his mom. I'm often very busy in the kitchen, and my husband will come and give me a hug, and I have to let myself loose from the responsibility of getting the supper on, just to show him that I love him too, and that I'm not too busy to give him back a hug.
I'm blushing like mad, I guess. But I think there's another area too, and that is the area of loyalty. I'll never forget the time that my mom made a macaroni and cheese casserole, which appeared on our table a lot of suppers, and sound a little resentful, don't I? And I don't mean to be, but this one night I was tired. I'd just come in from work, and I said more to myself, but some people around me at the table heard me. She's made macaroni and cheese again. And down at the far end of the table was my father, and he said, "She? You mean your mother? You mean my wife?" And boy, it got quiet. And I know I felt myself sweating great drops. But it taught me that, boy, there is a way to really show what's important in a home. And I'm learning all kinds of things about how to show my loyalty to her. I think it's appropriate for discussing, too, the whole business of how do we stay together? How does the marriage work?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is the children are with me, of course, more hours of the day than they are with you, and they'll come and ask me about if they can do something. And I'll say, well, let's talk to Dad about it. And they'll say, but Dad won't be home till late, and then I'll be in bed, and so I'll have to give them the sense of, but Dad is the final authority here. As far as I can see, I may be making a decision that might be wrong, and I want to let them know that I look to you for the leadership, and I want them to see there that the father is the head of the house, and it is important that I don't make decisions without knowing how you feel about something. And I've been learning that more and more in the last few years, especially that now that they are teenagers.
Leadership is tough, though, isn't it? hear men in the church bewailing the fact that they feel so inadequate at that business. Yes, I think all of us husbands, if we admit it openly, admit it honestly, we all have to say, who, like the Apostle Paul, is sufficient for these things? Leadership in the home. And I'm glad that Paul answers his question there later in that Corinthian letter and says, God is our sufficiency. He is our sufficiency, because the leadership issue is just something that haunts me as a husband and a father. It's so easy to see why so many husbands abdicate on that. It's one of the hardest things in the world. And I think it's because we've mixed up our priorities. Home is the place we want to go to and relax after work. And guess what? All those decisions are waiting for you at home. And you've got to be sharp on your toes for that.
Does he ever make a wrong decision, Val?
As he said, we're both very dysfunctional. We're sinners.
Does the bear eat berries?
Yes, and the joy to me is that I can trust God. Again, God is sovereign. And as I said, Walt's parents encouraged us to allow mistakes to happen. And we can trust the Lord to even use a mistake for His glory and for the children's good. Of course, I've made some very stupid decisions without Walt's being around and without the time for me to be able to ask him. And later on, I found out that my husband didn't like that decision at all that I made. And I can simply, ask his forgiveness and even ask the children's forgiveness and tell them that I was unwise, in making a decision like that. But going back to that whole loyalty issue is that we are together as a unit, and if I do make an unwise decision, we have the forgiveness because of Christ. We have the harmony in our hearts that comes from knowing God allowed a mistake, and He's going to use it. And I'm thankful that I have a husband who's very forgiving. And I'll ask him sometimes now, give me some things that I need to work on, I need to change. And he'll say, no, you're not the sinner, I'm the sinner. But I, of course, know that I'm sinning just as much.
Thanks so much, Val and Walt. And I like especially what you said, Val, that you're learning to trust God in your husband. I think every wife has questions about some of her husband's decisions. Mm-hmm. But the great thing is to remember he is your husband. God put him in a position of headship. So we have to trust God in him. We'll be talking more with my daughter, Val, and her husband, Walt Shepard. Thank you so much for being with me.